Good morning, everybody. My name's Phil Wendling, and I'm a house parent here at St. Joseph's Indian School. And this morning, I'm going to read for you a book called Lewis and Clark, Explorers of the American West. June 20th, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson asked his private secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, to lead an expedition from the Mississippi River to the West Coast. Lewis agreed. As co-leader, he chose William Clark, who had once been his commanding officer in the Army. On their journey, they would explore ways of opening the fur trade. They would try to find a water route across the continent that would make travel easier. They would also study the land and animals and learn more about the Indians in the West. The expedition was called the Corps of Discovery. Between December 1803 and May 1804, it took shape at the mouth of the Wood River, where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers meet. Clark trained the men, while Lewis spent much of his time in St. Louis making preparations. In the party were 14 soldiers, 9 volunteers from Kentucky, Clark's slave York, 2 French rivermen, and an interpreter, and Lewis's Newfoundland dog, Seaman. There were also 9 rivermen and 7 soldiers who went along for extra protection in the wilderness. These extra men planned to return home that fall. On a rainy Monday, May 14, 1804, Clark and the men started up the Missouri. Lewis was in St. Louis and would join the expedition in a few days. The group traveled in a 55-foot keel boat and 2 huge dugout canoes called pirogues. They led 2 horses along the bank to bring in game shot by the hunters. Boats carried clothing, tools, scientific books, medicine, rifles, goods for trading with the Indians, and a special powerful air gun to impress them. In case they had no other transportation, Lewis had included a collapsible iron canoe he called the Experiment. In the event they ran out of food, he had brought a thick, gooey, portable soup. After 2 days, the Corps of Discovery reached St. Charles. 5 days later, Lewis joined them and their journey began. The swift current and sandbars of the Missouri made rowing hard and poling tricky. Often the men had to tow the boats through the muddy water. Lewis frequently walked on shore, taking notes on plants and animals. Clark stayed with the boats, mapping their course. It got very hot. Mosquitoes, gnats, and ticks tormented everyone. Some of the men got sick, but the hunters kept the group well stocked with game, and on July 21st, they reached the mouth of the Platte River. High on a bluff, 3 days later, they met with Oto and Missouri Indians. Lewis and Clark couldn't understand the Indian language. Their interpreter, George Drouillard, translated the Indian sign language. Lewis gave a speech about peace and trade with Americans. He told them that the Great Father in Washington wanted the chiefs to visit. Then he draped medals from President Jefferson around the chiefs' necks. He fired the air gun, hoping the noise would awe them. Soon after, Sergeant Charles Floyd died of a burst appendix. He was the only member of the expedition to die during the 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days of the journey. Pressing on, the men began to see animals they had never seen or even imagined. Antelope and prairie dogs, a white pelican, a jackrabbit, coyotes. As trees became fewer, buffalo herds seemed to blanket the plains. This is a picture of the men meeting with the Native Americans, right? And giving the chiefs medals put around their neck. And then there's the buffalo, right? How do we say buffalo in Lakota?
Tatanka.
Tatanka, good. August 29th, the Corps met with the friendly tribe of Yankton Sioux. A few weeks later, they discovered that their cousins upriver, the Teton Sioux, were not so friendly. The Corps spent 4 tense days with them before meeting the more hospitable Arikaras, who were farmers. They admired Clark's slave, York, the first black man they had ever seen. Toward the end of October, the expedition stopped for a winter near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa Indians. The men completed Fort Mandan on November 20th. The fort had 8 connected log cabins arranged in a V with a high fence and an open end. Here you can see the Native Americans are meeting a black man for the first time. And then here's a picture of the fort that they built. There's a lot of work cutting down all those trees, I'll bet, huh? Snow, ice, and below zero temperatures made everyone miserable. But Riverman Pierre Cruzat lifted everyone's spirits by playing his fiddle as the group danced at Christmas. The Mandans and the Hidatsas welcomed the explorers to their large, round lodges. The Hidatsa chiefs told Lewis and Clark that they knew about the geography of the Rocky Mountains. During the winter, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French Canadian living with the Hidatsas, joined the expedition as an interpreter. His teenage Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, joined them too. On February 11th, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste. On April 7th, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent several soldiers and rivermen back to St. Louis on the keel boat. They were to take 4 magpies and a prairie dog, boxes of skins and horns, Indian articles, small samples of soil and plants, and Clark's maps and charts to President Jefferson. Here you see the guys, they're all dancing. The man's playing the fiddle around the campfire. And then, you know, they're meeting with an interpreter who could talk to all the natives that they run into. Same day, the Corps of Discovery, now numbering 32 and a baby, pushed upriver into the unknown. They traveled in the 2 pirogues and in 6 dugout canoes they had made during the winter. It stayed cold, but the plains were green and game was everywhere. The Corps began to encounter grizzly bears. Lewis first saw the Rocky Mountains on May 26th. He wrote in his journal of his joy, but also of the difficulties which this snowy barrier would most probably throw in my way to the Pacific. Already he seemed aware that no river could come close to crossing these mountains, that there would be no water route to the west coast. Ever been to the Rocky Mountains? Yeah. Even in the summertime, in August, there's snow clear up to the top of some of those mountains. It never melts. June 2nd, the expedition came to a fork in the river, which branch was the Missouri. They didn't know. If the explorers made a wrong choice, the passes through the Rockies might be blocked off by snow before they could reach them. The North Fork was muddy like the Missouri. The South Fork clear and gravelly, as if it came from the mountains. Only the captains preferred the second choice. Lewis went ahead on land to explore the South Fork. When he reached the Great Falls of the Missouri River on June 13th, he knew he and Clark had made the right choice. Falls were magnificent, but there were so many it took a month to get around them. With bleeding feet, the men made makeshift wagons and cleared 18 miles of undergrowth. There were hailstorms, mosquitoes, rattlesnakes, and grizzlies. When they finally struggled back to the Missouri River, the experiment's buffalo hide cover leaked and it was left behind. July 19th, the Corps passed through a huge chasm Lewis named the Gates of the Rocky Mountains. When they reached the 3 forks of the Missouri, Sacagawea declared that the Hidatsas had kidnapped her from the Shoshones at this very spot. Lewis and Clark named the 3 forks the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers. They took the westernmost one, the Jefferson. When they turned up a stream into the mountains, they began to realize they would need horses to continue. From Sacagawea, the Corps knew they were in Shoshone territory. When they found a tribe from which they hoped to get horses, the chief, Kamawite, turned out to be Sacagawea's brother. Sacagawea helped interpret. The Corps traded goods for the horses, hid their canoes by sinking them with stones, and set out over Lemhi Pass to the Lemhi Fork of the Salmon River. A week later, through snow and sleet, they struggled over Lost Trail Pass into Flathead Valley and a camp they called Traveler's Rest. Then they followed the Lolo Trail across the Bitterroot Mountains. Wet, cold, and hungry, they could find no game. When Lewis's portable soup became unbearable, they killed and ate a colt. Reaching the Clearwater River, the Corps met a tribe of friendly Nez Perce, or the Pierce Nose Indians. Chief Twisted Hair agreed to look after their horses until their return. On October 7th, they started down the Clearwater to the Snake and Columbia Rivers in 5 dugout canoes they had made during their visit. Sometimes the men lowered the canoes through the rapids on ropes. Other times they ran the rapids or carried everything around them. When they glimpsed an Indian in a sailor's jacket, they knew their goal was near. They reached the Pacific Ocean in mid-November. It rained all winter. The men built Fort Clatsop inland from the sea. Lewis and Clark worked on their notes and journals. Everyone was bored and ill. On March 23, 1806, they started for home. If they didn't reach the Missouri before it froze, they'd be spending another winter in the wilderness. Traveling upstream, the Corps had to lug canoes around larger rapids and tow them up the smaller ones. They visited Chief Yelpalit and the friendly Walla Walla Indians. Then they moved out overland and set up Camp Copochnes, 50 or 60 miles above the mouth of the Clearwater. Some of the men traded buttons from their uniforms to the Nez Perce for food. Clark traded medical advice and medicines. Chief Twisted Hair returned most of their horses, and on June 15th, they started back over the Lolo Trail. Forced to turn around because the snow was so deep, they set out again on June 24th with 3 Nez Perce guides. 6 days of struggle brought them to Travelers Rest. There the expedition separated. With most of the group, Clark traveled south, then east to explore the Yellowstone River. With a few men, Lewis traveled east to Great Falls, then north to explore Maria's River. On July 27th, Blackfeet Indians tried to steal the rifles belonging to Lewis's party. 2 of the Indians were killed. Lewis and Clark caught up with one another on the Missouri on August 12th. Before that, Pierre Cruzat accidentally shot Lewis in the upper thigh while they were hunting. Going downstream on the Missouri was much easier than coming up. The Corps left Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and the baby, whom Clark had called Pomp, with the Mandans on August 17th. The Mandan chief, Big White, agreed to go along to Washington. The Corps reached St. Louis on September 23, 1806. People lined up along the riverbanks and cheered. The entire nation had thought the members of the expedition had died in the wilderness. Only President Jefferson had held out hope that Lewis and Clark would return. There you can see he shot him by accident, I hope. And then you can see they returned and the people were very happy to have them back. And so nowadays, all that territory that they discovered, they mapped out, and now, you know, we live right here in South Dakota in what was the Louisiana Territory. So I'm grateful that you listened. That's the end of the story for today. It's good to have you, and next week, same time, same channel, right here.
Thank you.